Now I want to get to perhaps the most difficult and subtle part of the discussion, which I'm calling the precipitating factor, the replacement of mortgage bankers with casino capitalists. Maybe there's a better word than precipitating. It was clearly important, and it needs a further elaboration. Let's go back to the table I threw up. There's no question that while the federal share of non-traditional mortgages was 70% of all mortgages, 60% of principal value, this was $4.6 trillion worth of mortgages. There is no question, however, that Wall Street, countrywide, Wall Street is a loose term I'm using for the private sector. There's no question that there were private sector companies that were also involved. We would have had a very different experience had the Federal Reserve not had negative interest rates. Had they followed the Taylor rule, they would have had much higher rates of interest, and it would have been much more expensive to finance mortgages. We would have had an overwhelmingly different experience if the federal government, through Barney Frank, if you ever heard of him, he put his name on Frank Dodd, through others, it was Democrats and Republicans. The ownership society was a phrase of President George W. Bush. We would have had a very different experience had the federal government not made a massive assault on the credit markets and instituted these non-traditional mortgages. However, there is also no question that there were accomplices in this, and many of those accomplices were on Wall Street and were technically capitalists, portrayed as capitalists. So the question I want to ask is, from my perspective, how did the worst get on top? Now, that's a phrase from Friedrich Hayek in a classic book of his called The Road to Serfdom. He meant something very different by it. But my point is that, I'll read from what I wrote up here. How did the banker we love to hate, the SOB and the starched collar, who wouldn't give you the mortgage because your credit wasn't good, get replaced by the banker we also hate, the crapshooter who gave everyone mortgages? When I was a journalist in the mid-1970s, I worked briefly for public broadcasting, a PBS station in New York, and it was a show called The Money Show, which never got off the ground, but we did a pilot on mortgages. And in that case, it was all about the starched banker who wouldn't give you the mortgage, who was too tough on those who came across his desk. You didn't have a high enough credit score, your employment history isn't good enough, you need more of a down payment, because obviously, if you're going to give out a 20 to 30-year mortgage, it's a collateralized loan for sure. But you don't want to foreclose. You don't want to go through the hassle of repossessing. You want mortgages that can pay. And most mortgages, prime mortgages, have about a 1% default rate, because that's by design. You want those credit risks to be credit worthy. And when you talk to people like Pinto and others who were credit analysts, they really did have a whole science that they were proud of. 3 C's called credit, character, and collateral for evaluating people with mortgages. Because if you have a lot of bad debts, your business isn't going to do too well. Because here's another little homily about the profit and loss system. Profits encourage risk-taking, to be sure, but losses encourage prudence. So how did prudence go out the window? Well, I analogize it to another fairly standard example. In the late 1990s, I think there was a Fed-induced internet bubble. How did the momentum players elbow aside the fundamentalists? How did we have this insanity where people, money managers who looked for companies to make profits, who bought companies because they thought those companies had good earnings prospects, how did they get elbowed aside by the bubble meisters who bought on momentum, who didn't care whether the internet stock made any profits or not? That's what happens in the capitalist system. There are always, especially on Wall Street, irrationally exuberant types. And when you have create a certain atmosphere and a certain system, they're the ones who begin running the show. Now, I'm going to work over this issue in different ways, approach it from different ways, perhaps not as systematically as I should. But I'm going to begin with an example. That's Angelo Mazzillo, who was head of Countrywide for many years, Countrywide Finance, which issued mortgages by the bushel full. I'm calling him the primary capitalist. He's been fined. He paid big bucks for whatever. He was actually defended in the Wall Street Journal by a columnist I usually admire, Holman Jenkins, who said that Mazzillo really shouldn't be indicted because how could he would have been indicted for not having sufficient foresight. He would have been indicted because he made a mistake. He didn't realize that those mortgages were going to go south. And you can't throw a person in prison for that. Well, probably you can't. But I think the point that Holman Jenkins was missing is that Angelo Mazzillo had no business being in the mortgage banking business. He didn't know a thing about it. He was a creature of Fannie and Freddie in his early years. All he knew was that if you originate mortgages, you can sell them to the government. That's a cash machine. That's not mortgage banking. And here is Angelo Mazzillo being celebrated at Harvard, delivering the Harvard Dunlop Lecture. There's a whole research outfit at Harvard. They come up with some of the most amazing statements, even to this day, about housing for the home ownership for the poor. Mazzillo said this at his lecture. We celebrated as a housing leader to highlight the importance of housing as a policy and research area. He said, from my point of view, if 80% of subprime borrowers make mortgage payments on time, then shouldn't we as a nation be justifiably proud that we are dramatically increasing home ownership opportunities for those who would have been traditionally left behind. Forgive the typo again. Well, 80% of subprime borrowers make the mortgage. That meant a 20% default rate. 20%, you're issuing 1 out of 5 of these mortgages are going to default. They're not going to make the payments on time. Prime mortgages had customarily a 1% default rate. If you had have a 20% default rate, no matter how you figure the numbers on losses, you have to have at least 2 to 3 extra points on that mortgage in order to cover that enormous loss ratio. Anybody in the mortgage business could have told him that. But why should he care? He's selling those mortgages to the government. This is a man who, it's like talking about how I make pizza and I put ice cream on it and then I shove it in the oven. Man didn't have a clue about mortgages, and he's being celebrated at Harvard as a statesman in the mortgage business. Now, there was something else that went. So he was a creature of Fannie and Freddie. He gained a reputation for being a smart mortgage banker, and now here I'm going to have to confess something terrible about my own magazine, Barron's. Every year they issue a list of the 30 best CEOs in the country. They issued their list about a week or two ago. They don't ask me. I nominated one guy, John Mackey, by the way, of Whole Foods, but he didn't make the list this year, and has not made the list in any year. But what they did for the best CEO of 3 years running was that one of the 30 they listed was Angelo Mazzillo. And a big embarrassment from my perspective. They certainly should have eaten crow, and they should certainly understand the difference between a capitalist and a crapitist, between a man like, if you forgive the gratuitous insults to people like Dick Cheney, people who become CEOs of companies and don't have a clue about how to run a company. They just have connections in Washington. That's how the worst get on top. And my magazine was not sensitive enough to realize that. Now, I'm mentioning